I am very excited to introduce Merri today for seminar. So Merri is Ph.D. candidate in our lab. So sort of the typical introduction, Merri got her bachelor's degree actually in journalism from Ohio University, and then went on to get a master's degree at Ohio University in conservation biology. She did several wildlife tech jobs in between before deciding to go back to school to get a Ph.D. And she started with me at George Mason. Merri was my very first graduate student at George Mason, and then was able to move over here to University of Maryland with me, which so thanks to a lot of faculty for allowing that and making that happen. Merri was my first grad student, as I mentioned. So during her graduate career as a PhD student, she received a USGS Fish and Wildlife Adaptation Fellowship to work at the Climate Adaptation Center here in Northern Virginia, which led to them hiring her back a year later as an ORISE fellowship, which she is doing right now, working with that same team at CASC. She also received the Urban Forestry Student Scholarship from Virginia Trees, and then at the last Maryland-Delaware Wildlife Society meeting, she received the Outstanding Wildlife Student Award. She's also the lead author or co-author on 4 different papers during her PhD, more papers than that, but 4 during her PhD, and currently has 2 in review. So lots of accolades for Merri. But Merri has more than her accomplishments. She's a first-generational student, comes from a very poor area in Appalachia, and so has overcome a lot of barriers to get where she is. And over the last several years, she's done dozens of Skype interviews or Skype with a scientist interviews ever since COVID started, to give presentations at low-income schools throughout North America, and has really been a strong advocate for those less privileged and marginalized communities. Merri is a special student because we started together, and we started about 3 months before COVID sort of sent us all home. So our academic journey has been tied to COVID. Her first 2 years as a PhD student and my first 2 years as a professor were during sort of a scary and stressful time. So I'm very grateful for Merri's sort of grace and flexibility with me, as probably not being the best mentor I could have been, but also sort of her initiative. So one of the papers she will talk about today was a pivot when George Mason wouldn't let us do any field work. She pivoted to work on a lit review, which she'll discuss. I was over there telling students, just stay alive. And she was like, but I want to write a paper. So actually got that through. And you'll see that in the presentation today. One thing I do want to mention before I wrap this up is that's not going to be evident in her talk or in her CV is how important she has been in sort of setting up our long-term research project that we have in DC. We have a long-term wildlife research project in DC. And Merri did a majority of the work getting this thing set up. The study design, getting permits, talking to landowners, going and actually finding these points in the middle of the forest, excuse me, to put up the cameras. And already several students have run through this research design and the study that we have that's long-term, and many, many more will run through in the future. So her contribution to what we will understand about urban wildlife in DC will go on and on even before she's gone. So I want to acknowledge that and say that I'm very proud of Merri, and Merri, you should be very proud of all the work you've done over the last several years. So with that, I will hand it over to Merri.
All right. Yeah, I'm grateful to give a seminar today, and we're going to be talking about 2 chapters of my dissertation on urban wildlife. Let me see if I can use the computer controls. Perfect. So I come from a very rural area originally, and I had to kind of flip my own thinking a lot when I entered working in an urban system, as I had never worked in a city before, and especially never worked with wildlife in a major city. So one of the first things I kind of explored was, why should we care about urban wildlife? Wildlife is not really the first thing you think of when you think of major cities. You don't really associate them immediately with animals. But urban ecosystems are actually one of the fastest growing ecosystems on our planet, with about 2/3 of the human population expected to live in cities by 2050. And because of that, that's going to end up being how a lot of people actually experience nature or experience interacting with wild animals. So it's really important to take that into consideration and the importance of this kind of research. And because cities are built by humans and a human-dominated system, entirely thinking about how past city planning, how that's potentially extirpated species, how those species might be returning to the environment, can drastically influence the current and future wildlife habitat that's available in cities, and this subsequently will influence the biodiversity in cities, the conservation initiatives, and how we actually potentially go in to restore some of that biodiversity that maybe was once lost. So again, I'm just going to cover 2 chapters today, my second and my third chapter. My fourth chapter, we will not have time to go over. However, I will be defending at the end of this month, next month, I guess, March 28th at 1 p.m., location TBD. So I'm sure an email will go out about that. If you'd like to attend, I would love to have you there. Yeah, and these are the 2 chapters we're going to be going over. I do also want to take note that I've incorporated a lot of our own camera trap photos into my presentation. So any of the animal photos you see are animals that are in the very urban DC metropolitan area. So let's first talk about this literature review. As Travis said, this was kind of my pandemic lockdown baby. A lot of people were learning how to make like sourdough bread and learning new like knitting skills. I did a lit review. So there are really 2 major components of this literature review. The first one, a really interesting literature review that provided a lot of insight into the history of urban wildlife research, was published in 2012 by Maglia et al. And so the first component is we wanted to kind of duplicate the methodology used in that literature review to see how potentially the status of wildlife research had changed between decades. And then the second component, we kind of just added to that literature review a little bit and broadened it to include all journals. We added different topics, different taxa, and kind of expanded on some of those results a bit more, which we'll talk about momentarily. So the objectives for this literature review: first, we wanted to understand the current emerging trends in peer-reviewed papers on urban wildlife. I personally love literature reviews. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this for a chapter of my dissertation. I always seek them out when I'm trying to understand a new topic, because we know that literature reviews kind of assess research gaps and data gaps, so you know like where the data gaps are and where we can potentially kind of point our own research studies towards. And again, we're examining the differences, which we'll get into, between the trends that were found in Maglia et al. 2012 and that we found in our current literature review. And so I'm just going to go over some of the basic methods that Maglia et al. 2012 used, because we did duplicate these for the first part of our literature search. So they focused on these 16 high-impact journals that publish wildlife research. And they used Web of Science to search the term urban wildlife in all 16 of these journals. Again, these are high impact journals. You're probably familiar with some of them, 10 and 11, like Nature and Science, for instance. Those are 2 major ones that most people in science know about. And then if you do any sort of landscape ecology or wildlife biology research, you probably know about 15 and 16, especially Wildlife Society Bulletin, that's tied in with the Wildlife Society institution. And so I'm just going to pull a couple of main results from the Maglia et al. 2012 literature review and what their paper found. So the first one, when we're looking at taxa, throughout all the publications that they pulled from these 16 high impact journals, primarily those publications were focused on either urban birds or urban mammals. Those made up the majority of taxa in all the studies across the board. But even though they came up with 571 papers to base from those 16 journals to base this information on, only 2% of all the literature from those 16 high impact journals was urban wildlife specific research. So actually a pretty small percentage from 1971 to 2010 when their literature review took place. And then this might not come as a surprise. Academics made up most of the first author publications, so about 75%. And most of the research from those first authors, they looked at what geographic area the first author was affiliated with and what institution they were working out of. And most of the research done was from North America, Europe, and Australia, which is actually really unfortunate because that leaves a pretty big data gap for South America, Africa, and Asia. And so we wanted to duplicate these methods and look through these 16 high impact journals first for our literature review. And we did the following decades, so we kind of like picked up where they left off, and we did 2011 through 2020. And so we also want to expand the breadth of the search a little bit. So the second component of this is we not only use Web of Science, we also expanded to use Google Scholar. And I have been published not in any of those high impact journals until this paper came out. And you know, there's a lot of value in research that is not necessarily in a high impact academic journal, right? So I wanted to expand this literature review to encompass all journals regardless of the impact factor as well. And so we selected the relevant publications from these journals. We removed things like opinion letters that had been submitted, theses or dissertations that weren't peer reviewed yet. And then we pulled out other literature reviews as well and did not include those because we wanted to focus specifically on like the research aspect. We removed any duplicates that we found between the two search engines, and then we did the same thing Maglia et al. Did. We categorized the taxotype that had been studied in each of the publications, the first author affiliation, the geographic area that the author was affiliated with, journal subject, and then also paper topic. And so this graph just kind of shows you the uptick in urban wildlife publications since 1971, which I think was the first one that they could find. So this like clear rectangle here is Maglia et al.'s literature review from 2010, and then the shaded one is where we picked up using their methodology. So you can see that there's a steady increase since about 1999-2000 of urban wildlife publications being published more often in these high impact journals, which is awesome. If you're an urban wildlife researcher, it means that people are starting to pay attention more, and this is starting to be valued a bit more overall in wildlife biology. I also just wanted to pull this up really quickly because I think this is kind of an interesting result. You can see the decades broken down on the left-hand side. And then we just pulled out the number of publications. So 1971 to 1980, there was one. So not a lot of urban wildlife research being done during that time period. But from 2011 to 2020, we can see we had 532 total from these 16 journals, which is an increase from the 431 from the previous decade that Maglia et al. Found. I also just, again, want to point out most of these are from academic researchers, first author affiliation academic. So we went from 75 to 88, so almost a 10% increase in a decade, which made kind of the other numbers drop down. So people that were publishing from government entities dropped from 13 to 7%, NGO percentage dropped from 11 to 3, and then private increased, but only marginally. So most of this research is being done by academic institutions. And then as far as looking at taxa, the differences between the 2 decades and the 16 journals for this. So birds and mammals clearly are still dominating the urban wildlife research field as far as publications go from the 16 journals. We saw a slight increase in arthropod research, which is great, and a lot of that was because more pollinator research is starting to be done in urban areas. Fish and herpetiles unfortunately remain pretty low, and then our other studies that weren't taxa specific remained a bit low as well. So after all that, we went back through and then we expanded the search, and this is the information from all journals across the board, which we went from 16 journals from the high impact journals to 214 total journals. So we added journals from disciplines like veterinary medicine, disease ecology, socio-ecological journals that kind of study the interface between humans and wildlife. And I ended up with about like 1,600 results total, but then once we filtered through and kind of pulled out duplicates or pulled out those other types of papers like theses and dissertations, we ended up with 634 total publications to collect our data from. So anything that's bold up here is actually a new subject that we kind of added through this broadened literature search. So we added papers in the topics of management, disease ecology, and social science. We added papers that focus on human-wildlife conflict very specifically, population and community ecology, spatial ecology, and even evolution and genetics were added. And I also want to point out that in the last year of our analysis, social sciences actually had the highest publication percentage, about 19% out of the total, which was kind of interesting. So we see that social science kind of aspect of urban wildlife upticking as well. As far as mammals and birds, those are 2 big ones across the board. Even in our expanded search, mammals and birds, as far as taxa goes, again, dominated. They won out against all the other taxa, but which mammals and birds? I wanted to break this down. So carnivores, rodents, and invasive species were our top mammal categories, and then I actually looked at what specific species those papers were studying. Coyote and red fox were our 2 top carnivores. Rodents, rats, and mice, that kind of makes sense, right? In a city setting, domesticated cats and feral hogs were our invasives. And then looking at birds, we had songbirds, raptors, and aquatic species that came out of the bird group. And of those, songbird studies rose to the top of the bird studies. However, songbirds weren't really studied in one specific species. They were actually most often studied in groups. As far as our raptors, we had owls and Cooper's hawk, which I thought was interesting, and then lots of urban wildlife literature from Australia on white ibises. And okay, what if we don't focus on taxa, right? I wanted to look at this too. So we had a lot of papers that kind of came out in the wash for our expanded search that weren't taxa specific. And most of these were methods papers. So a lot of different modeling methods to look at like spatial use for urban wildlife, a lot of urban planning papers to look at urban infrastructure and how that kind of intersects with wildlife diversity in urban areas, and a lot of education papers. So papers that kind of evaluate like what community response to wildlife species are, what community response to environmental education initiatives are, things like that. And then I also broke down whether these papers were applied or foundational. So by foundational, I mean they don't really have like a specific management application that the paper mentioned, and then the applied science papers did. So we can see that most of the wildlife papers from our broadened search were applied science, about 66%, and 33% were foundational. And again, that's kind of intuitive because we live so closely with wildlife in cities that you really can't study one without studying the other in some regard. And so we had a lot of applied science papers as well. So that is, my second chapter, my literature review. You can read it today. If you want to get down to the nitty gritty and some more of those statistics, I have like an entire table broken down of every single species that came out of our broadened literature search. And yeah, if anyone's looking for a project for the next 10 years, you can always update this paper again. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to switch from a more global scale to a regional scale, and we're going to talk about eastern wild turkey occupancy in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Which is probably one of my favorite talks for my dissertation to give. I didn't know I liked turkeys so much until I started doing this research. And again, you'll see a lot of turkey photos. I tried to preface where they were taken. So these two guys are from Shepherd's Parkway Park in Washington, D.C. So let's start with what we do know about eastern wild turkeys. They are native to the eastern and middle U.S., so this is an Audubon range map of wild turkeys. There are some subspecies you can see, like the Merriam's turkey, that's primarily out west. But we're focusing on this big dark blue shaded area, and this is where the eastern wild turkey's native range is. And then this white box up here is our study area in Washington, D.C. And turkeys are considered generalists for the most part. They can eat a pretty flexible diet, so they can eat anything from insects, vegetation, seeds, though opportunistically sometimes take small mammals if they need protein in their diet. Their home range, as far as like how big their actual range is in an area, is it tends to vary from the studies that I've looked at. I pulled information from one Virginia specific study that did spatial analysis with like GPS tagging the turkeys, and their range in that study was about 1.5 to 3 kilometers squared. And then they kind of have an interesting ecology too. They're very large birds, so they're pretty robust. They're big boys. So they tend to nest on the ground in like shrubs and heavily vegetated areas to kind of hopefully protect their nest from ground predators. And then to protect themselves while they're sleeping, they actually are able to hop up to the high branches of old growth trees that can support their weight. So they roost in trees at night and then come down during the day to forage and socialize. And we know from rural studies that they really like their edge habitat. Like they like the forest, they can live there. That's where they go to roost at night primarily, but they also like having that open field area to forage and socialize with flocks. So they really like having that kind of juxtaposition of habitats. And in our area, I just wanted to kind of cover some bases for us. So turkeys kind of have an interesting story in the DMV area. They were locally extinct in the 20th century due to habitat loss and overharvest, and a lot of that habitat loss actually came from urbanization agricultural initiatives on the landscape. They were extirpated entirely from the state of Virginia in 1920, and then the state of Virginia, in conjunction from some other eastern states, undertook like this big conservation effort to try to breed turkeys and release them. That failed and didn't do well, but they were able to get turkeys and translocate them back into Virginia from different states that did have populations that were thriving. And we actually started to see sightings of turkeys in our urban DC area in around 2006. But even though turkeys seem to be thriving in cities, which we'll talk about in a second, we don't have any published peer-reviewed data on how turkeys are using the urban landscape, which is where I came in. for this research, and one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this species. And we also know from the rural, very recent literature, I would say within the last 2 or 3 years, that they're actually starting to decline again in some of their native rural areas of their range, but we're not really sure why. There are a couple hypotheses. One is that it could potentially be related to like seasonal shifts and nesting shifts due to climate change. And so when I first got here, after we set up all of our cameras and I started pulling data, I started seeing pictures like this, just like a single guy with his back towards me. And I was like, I know this is a turkey. Why are you in the city, turkey? I was really confused. I kind of ignored it. I thought it was like a one-off thing. And then we started seeing pictures like this. And I was like, okay, these turkeys must be living here, and they're doing pretty well. Like, this is during their breeding season. You can see the males trying to impress these females in the flock. And so I did a Google search, and apparently there's turkeys doing really well in a lot of cities in the eastern and mid-US. So these are from 2 major publications. I think like New York Times and Washington Post did stories. I think these were from 2022. And in order to update that, I, like yesterday, just Google News turkeys, and you can see all these great headlines about urban wild turkeys. This is my favorite one in particular. And DC is also no stranger to human interactions with these turkeys. So I think it was in 2022, there was a very famous turkey on the internet that was terrorizing bikers on the Anacostia bike path by the river. And it was just one single male. They tried several times to trap and relocate him, but they were unable to do it. It did prompt the National Park Service to start putting up these signs because people were trying to get close to him, take pictures. A lot of people didn't even realize like what kind of animal this was because they, again, do not associate wild turkeys with living in cities. So although we've seen pictures of wild turkeys due to kind of how they're integrated in, like with Thanksgiving and all that, but to see one in person, yeah, I think a lot of people were extremely surprised by that, myself included. And one more famous case, I just wanted to highlight this girl who I was in touch with a land manager at Arlington National Cemetery. This went viral for this turkey following a funeral procession in 2022 or 2023. And then we're pretty sure we got this same female on our camera because in that time period, this was the only turkey we got at ENST. Yeah. So going back to studying these guys, this is our camera trap study. Every single one of these dots is a location of a camera. So we have 75 total sites, and that spans across the DC area, parts of Maryland and parts of Virginia. And cameras are placed at each site for about 30 days each season for the standard 4 seasons of the year. They're picked back up, we take them to the lab. We upload the photos on a database that uses triple species identification. Thank you to our undergrads for doing a lot of this photo ID work. What triple species confirmation means is that if there's an issue between 2 people identifying the same photo, someone says it's a turkey, someone says it doesn't, bounces that photo to me, and I say yes or no, that is a turkey. So we kind of have that confirmation process of the species. And data for this analysis that we're going to talk about was pulled from July 2020 to August 2021. So how did we look at turkey occupancy? We used an occupancy model that takes imperfect detection into account. So sometimes you can have an animal in a landscape, but you don't necessarily detect it. So this just kind of gives you like a very quick introduction to like how this model works. You survey an area, you do see the species, it gets a 1, you do not see the species, it's classified as a 0. But occupancy models take, again, if you don't detect the species, it doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't there, you just didn't detect it in that time period. So that's the great thing about using this type of model, and this is what we did with our camera trap photos. And this is a lot, so I'm just going to take time to briefly explain it. For each one of those points, so each point a camera was at, we created a 2-kilometer buffer around each camera site to look at landscape level variables at that site. I chose 2 kilometers because the best research we have on turkey home range in Virginia was again between 1.5 and 3 kilometers, so we kind of met in the middle at 2. We used a single season occupancy model across our 4 seasons for our data analysis. And we use a package in R called Dredge because we don't know very much about urban wild turkeys, at least from publications. And we only kind of can rely on our rural knowledge about the species. We use Dredge to look at all variable combinations for our model. And so our occupancy variables, we use a lot of large scale landscape level variables like canopy cover, so tree cover, wetland impervious surface, low vegetation, roadways, water. We also looked at distance of each site to the nearest roadway or the nearest water body to see if that would potentially influence occupancy. We looked at canopy height since they do use these tall trees. We used elevation in the area. We looked at human housing density since we're working in cities and human density can play a role. And we looked at landscape entropy as kind of a proxy for that edge habitat. So looking at open field or low vegetation versus canopy cover. And then season was also one of our occupancy variables as well. And for detection, so detection is just thinking about things that might influence your ability to detect the animal during a survey. We looked at temperature, maybe they're more active during the winter or the summer, average precipitation, and then the number of days the camera was out in the field. And so our results. We detected turkeys at 19 of 75 sites. They are in the, any site that we detected a turkey is in yellow over here. 6 were in Virginia, 9 were in Maryland, and 4 were in DC. And all of our cameras are in green spaces, and green space is just any kind of public accessible greener area in a city, so public parks primarily. We also had cameras in cemeteries and golf courses, kind of like recreational areas. So most of these were in urban parks, 18 of them, and we did get 1 turkey at a golf course in Arlington, which the managers there were a big fan of him. And so after we ran our model selection, we had 3,000 total models of combinations of all of those variables that we just looked at. And so we looked at the top 25 models that fell within the top Delta AIC. And because those top models included a combination of the exact same variables, we just went ahead and picked that very top model. And the 3 variables that influence occupancy there were canopy height, distance to road, and elevation. And then when we looked at our confidence intervals for those 3 variables, we actually pulled out specifically distance to roadway from each point and elevation as being the 2 most significant variables in the study. And so these are just kind of some of our results in graph form. So significant relationship between occupancy and elevation. We can see by this graph, the higher the elevation, the lower the probability of occupancy. So as the elevation gets higher, the turkeys are less likely to occupy those field sites. And I kind of wanted to throw this up here to give you an idea of what the elevation in the DC area looks like. So you can see your low elevation kind of goes from green to blue here. And all of that low elevation we can kind of see follows the Anacostia and the Potomac riverways that come down through DC, Virginia, and Maryland. And this gives you, again, kind of another different look at that. So these are our detections. Each of these, again, is a camera site, and the detections are just like how many photos we got in our study period of turkeys. So again, we can kind of see these low elevation areas right here are where we're getting our most turkey detections, down here along the riparian corridors along the Potomac and over by the Anacostia River. And then we also had a strong correlation between occupancy and distance to roadways, meaning that habitat further from a roadway, so a field site that was further from the roadway, the higher the probability of occupancy for turkeys. So they're apparently not big fans of occupying areas near the road. So why? And that's a great question, and that's something we're still trying to kind of figure out, right? Because again, we don't really have any urban specific literature to fall back on with these assumptions. But we do think that positive correlation with distance to roadways, this could just indicate that turkeys are avoiding areas with high anthropogenic sound and activity. Turkeys have really sensitive hearing and eyesight, which is what makes them so difficult to hunt. And what frustrates hunters so much about trying to hunt them is they can see really, really long distances. So maybe they're just like not liking the fact that we have these multi-lane highways that are really big and really busy all the time. And they're trying to avoid those areas. And with songbirds, there have been studies that have seen that kind of anthropogenic sound can kind of affect communication between species or between individuals in a group, whether it be like mating displays, or it can disrupt communication between like a mother and its poults. And we also had a negative correlation with elevation. This could just be because turkeys are attracted to the benefits that the riparian corridors for both of our major rivers kind of provide them, whether that be habitat and kind of like a sheltered area with less people, which in our study area, these rivers are again at low elevations, and other studies have seen the benefits of kind of promoting and restoring riparian areas. They have a lot of potential prey species, lots of vegetation, yeah, so that could be one reason for that as well. And so for future management, tying this all back together, what does this all mean for urban wild turkeys? So we can really take two key points away from this, at least for the Washington, D.C. area. And again, it would be great to redo this study in cities that also have high turkey populations, just kind of see the individual differences and the ways they're using landscapes between cities. But for our study area specifically, restoring, protecting, and prioritizing riparian corridors seems to be a great way to provide turkey habitat. Because the riparian corridors in our area aren't necessarily right up against paths along the river, this could also be a great way to keep the turkeys away from people. And also, if we're thinking about people and how they've been interacting with the species in our area, in other cities, looking at those kind of crazy headlines for human-turkey wildlife conflict, prioritizing educational signage along riparian trails that are near our rivers or communities that are located near the rivers could be a great way to kind of educate people on how to interact with these animals when they see them. Because just observationally based on our camera data, I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. And future directions. So there's a ton of work that can be done on urban wild turkeys. We are missing a lot of data that looks at this species specifically. So again, comparisons across cities could be really useful for looking at different management strategies. I think vegetation specific indices, so looking at the types of vegetation that turkeys might be attracted to, could be really interesting. And of course, to get a better idea of how they're actually using the landscape and especially how they're moving across the landscape, doing GPS tracking for home range and movement would also be probably a really great way to get some more information on how this turkey is rebounding in urban areas as well. And so I just want to conclude by saying that if you want to talk about urban wildlife, urban turkeys, please feel free to email me. After starting this project, specifically my dissertation, I've got so many awesome memes and like videos of turkeys chasing people online that people have sent me. And then of course, I really want to thank Dr. Gallo for all of his help and having me come onto this project, my committee members, both at George Mason and here at UMD for all their help with editing, my lab mates for all their support. Our undergrad researchers are crucial for this camera study. They're the ones that kind of are at the front lines of IDing photos, and sometimes that can be really tedious if we get a lot of vegetation and not a lot of animals. UNs are the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which we collaborate with, co-authors for some of these publications, and the land managers who provide access to these camera sites. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put our cameras up and collect this data. And thank you for listening to my talk.
Great. I'll just remind everyone that you should have received a link to an evaluation in your email in the last few minutes. And those of you online can see the link to the evaluation in the chat. But we've got time for some questions for Merri.
Yes, Maddie.
Great presentation, Merri.
Thank you.
I have a question about your occupancy model. So
Sure.
Did you model for poults like hens and toms, or did you just do a few solitary?
We just did turkeys in general.
Okay.
We do know that they are breeding because we have a couple photos of either nesting female or a female with poults.
Oh, cool.
But we just don't really have the capability with the way this is set up to like track their reproduction strategy or anything. So we just did turkey detections in general, regardless of age class for this.
Okay, great, thank you.
Good question. Yes.
So what's the story that's emerging about how they interact with the predators like foxes and coyotes?
Again, that's a great question, and that's something I've thought a lot about. And again, I think it's going to take some more research to get the answer to that. But you would think it would be harder for them to breed because they have like maybe a higher density of nest predators, like in one central area that are all using the same like shared habitat. But again, that being said, they seem to be doing well just tangentially and observationally. So I don't really know the answer to that. And that would be a really great research focus for somebody to look at nest predation in urban versus rural, turkeys.
Okay.
Yes.
I was curious about, in terms of population modeling, did you reach out to any like butchers or any hunter harvesting locations to try to get like increase in numbers from that range?
Yeah, so I did get hunter harvest data from Virginia specifically to kind of look at that, and there's not data for like the counties that our cameras were in because they are so urban. There's just not turkey hunting going on there. But the harvest rates have been pretty steady across Virginia, and they haven't fluctuated too much. I know a paper recently came out that I think was looking at like Tennessee and Georgia, where the harvest rates are down. And that's one of the things that's kind of making people do more research on like the population and the population numbers in general. And they think that, again, some of that might be tied to climate change, shifting like nesting season, or like the spring green up might be shifting, and that might be affecting their food availability. And then in turn, when the females actually produce eggs. Those are just some theories, but yeah, I got the hunting data from Virginia.
Sure, thanks.
Yes.
So, this is a really good talk. I don't know much about wildlife, but I was just curious about the occupancy model. You were saying that there's a way to account for, like, it's there, but you didn't. Can you explain that? Like, how would you make that decision? I don't understand.
Yeah, so the occupancy model kind of automatically takes that into effect in the equation when you use it. And what we're using for detection, so those variables, we use like precipitation and temperature. Those didn't come out as having any significant effect on our ability to detect a turkey in our specific study. But it is possible that that your detection can be affected in some way by different variables, or if this was done in a more traditional field survey where you go out and actually like count the animals. That's primarily what this, I think, occupancy models kind of started being used for, was imperfect detection. Like maybe you counted 10 turkeys and there are actually 20 on the landscape. It's just a way to kind of account for that potential miss, like those gaps in data. Yes.
You saw a relationship with roadways. Did you think about differentiating between large versus small roadways? Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, that definitely could. We didn't do that specifically for this study. We did look at like bike paths versus roadways, and bike paths and walking trails didn't come out as significant. But yeah, I mean, I think that, DC has a lot of major highways, and if the field site is located at a major highway, like maybe that noise or the traffic itself is just more of a deterrent than a smaller roadway. It could be really interesting to redo this and also focus on like residential areas more heavily. So if the turkeys are using like people's actual property, like private property. But yeah, that's not something that we did, but it would be really cool. Sure.
When you were doing the AIC model, did you look at any green space connectivity in the different areas of the study?
No, we did not use connectivity as a metric for this. That was something we started to do, and then because the urban landscape is so fragmented, I was having trouble delineating like what a patch was. Yeah, which might be just like user error with ArcGIS on my end, but I struggled a lot with like being able to say like this is a patch and this is like the connection between the different patches because of just like the urban mosaic. So ultimately we ended up dropping that because I didn't feel like I was being thorough enough with it in order to include it in the analysis and have it be accurate.
So I'm interested in your elevation variable. So this is sort of an easy thing to get from DEMs, right? So that it's
Right.
easily acquired. But you suggest that it may be really a surrogate for something else that's maybe more directly tied. I mean, it's less easy to imagine elevation by itself as sort of being the dominant driver.
Right.
But I mean, did you look at things like distance from streams? You suggest it's tied to like the riparian corridors. Did you look at like distance from major streams or things like that? Those would obviously be harder data to acquire than DEM data, but.
Yeah, so there was kind of, like we looked at distance to the nearest water body, but because, again, I think this has a lot to do with the fact that DC has a lot of like low-lying areas that potentially have like ponds and small streams. We didn't differentiate between like a small stream versus a major river. So I guess that could also have some impact and influence. But yeah, I don't think it's like elevation necessarily that's causing the probability of occupancy to be higher. I think it's some sort of landscape level variable that's associated with elevation. And our best guess, just kind of comparing maps and looking at habitat in the green areas along the river, was probably that it's more with like what the riparian corridor can provide, whatever that may be. It may be a food source. It may be just like protection, like nest protection from predation. But yeah.
Do you know, along with that, do you know if there could be a link between elevation and like heat islands?
Maybe that's, yeah, I mean, that's definitely possible as well. We looked at overall like tree canopy cover, but again, it was kind of a larger scale variable versus being like really refined. But yeah, I mean, that definitely has potential to also be an answer.
Which I guess like, you know, when we're thinking about heat, like things warming up, like in the context of climate change, like
Yeah.
for example, maybe in Tennessee and Georgia, like a heat island in the city might actually be a beneficial thing.
Right, it definitely could be, and maybe that's why they're able to use like the landscape the way they are, and they're doing well in cities kind of across the board versus more rural areas. That kind of like juxtaposition might play a role as well. It's really complex, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna follow up on Marty's question a little bit about this point of elevation and wondered if I assume they're studying more rural areas on them and, you know, I guess my broader question actually, as you were presenting even your literature review, is how much behavioral change do we expect to see between animals that are living in these urban environments, living in rural areas?
Right.
And how, you know, how do you interface that literature or can, you know, or in like in this example, for instance, can you look at the stuff that's been done in rural areas to make some inferences in this?
Yeah, so that's kind of a complex question, but it definitely depends on the animal species, right? So I know off the top of my head, there are studies that compare like predator-prey responses from animals in rural versus urbanized areas, and like deer are like less afraid of humans. They have a much longer response time to like be afraid of a person approaching them than they do in rural areas. And we kind of see that similarity with like songbirds, for instance. They tend to have like a longer response time to having a human approach them than they would in a more rural area, where as soon as maybe they see you, they fly away versus hanging out until you get close to them. That's a good question for these guys. I honestly don't know the answer. We looked at human housing density as a variable, thinking maybe that might play a role in areas with more like dense housing. There might be, maybe that potentially would be an area that they would be less likely to occupy just because of those consistent interactions with people. But that being said, I'm not really sure.
Just as a total aside, I'm from Oregon and we used to have turkey problems in the fall where they would come home and we would have them on the roof of the house. So
Yeah, I've heard of them attacking cars too. Apparently that they can see the reflection and that's a thing.
Well, I have my anecdote that, you know, I was a hunter as a kid, and turkeys are like rare 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just been remarkable over the last several decades to see how common they are just driving around the region. So, and just sort of generally speaking, the populations, I think.
Yeah, they're considered a very great conservation success story, kind of the reintroduction and translocation of them, just not as well known as more charismatic animals like wolves, I guess. But
Although they're starting to take again now, is what they think.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what she mentioned. I was a little interested.
It's like Georgia, Florida, and Alabama.
Southeast
states,
specifically.
Combined a bunch of money to do research now.
is there any connection to avian influenzas?
No, I don't think so. Most of at least the information that I've read that's been recently published, they say that there hasn't been much of a link with disease. So that's why they're kind of stumped on exactly what the mechanism is that's causing the decline.
People do like turkey legs down there.
That's true. Well, that's why they want to study it, so they can make sure that the hunting stays available. Yeah.
So I lived in Georgia for a while, and I lived in Tennessee, and I remember I went to a fair in Tennessee, and I had to get a turkey leg. Like, they were like right next to the candy house. Also, I wanted to ask you, so I'm from West Virginia, in Appalachia.
Yeah.
Lower Appalachia. I just wondered, like, where you are.
I'm from Southeast Ohio, so like Athens. I went to school at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and I'm from like an hour south of there originally. Yeah. My family's primarily from West Virginia.
Did you see any polls on your camera?
Not a ton. So we do have a few photos, and one of them I think I put in this presentation at some point, where we did see juvenile turkeys, but predominantly we saw adults, I would say, especially like with the larger flocks, we primarily saw adults on the camera, but we did see evidence that they are breeding. So how successful that breeding is, I don't know.
All right, well, outstanding presentation. Thank you.